Dawie Roodt, our guest in the Money Sense studio tonight, is with the Efficient Group. Let's go back to that whole thing, the push me, pull you thing here. Is there a chance, by getting involved with these Bric countries, that we're going to start having stuff pulled out of our country that we actually need here? And our economy is going to start turning turtle.
I think you're referring to the insert we just saw.
Yeah.
Just by the way, you know, Australia is the biggest gold producer in the world. South Africa used to be a significantly bigger gold producer, and we in fact lost a huge chunk of market share to the Australians during the 1980s. And in coal,
right?
Okay, so they took a lot of our markets, and we had a wonderful opportunity now to get back some of that market share, and we couldn't, simply because we couldn't get stuff out of the ground and get it to the ports quick enough, because our infrastructure is not there. Okay. So we have to do something about the infrastructure, and there's nothing wrong with exporting our minerals and our coal and also all our stuff to the rest of the world. Perhaps maybe the Indian economy, for example, can make better use of this. And the wonderful thing is that we've got something called the price mechanism. Supply and demand determine prices. If we keep prices for Eskom, for example, if you look at this insert, artificially low, that means the coal miner is going to lose out. Rather open it up, allow the market to do its magic and allocate the resources the most optimal way, and there's nothing wrong.
No, but there is, surely, because then that means that the price of coal will be driven up, Eskom's input costs will be higher, and they will charge us more for electricity.
Well, why don't we allow the market, the electricity market, why don't we allow the Chinese to come into South Africa to invest in electricity generation, for example? Because the Chinese, let's be frank about this, the Chinese are significantly more productive than our workers. And we, the consumers in the end, are the most important people. I want to get cheap electricity. So why do you want to keep electricity prices maybe artificially high? Because Eskom is not necessarily running at its as competitive or producing electricity as productive as the Chinese might, for example.
Okay, well, this is now why they used to call it political economics.
Political economics.
Yeah, exactly.
Politics.
Because there's unions involved there as well. Now, can you, excuse me, can you imagine how excited Kusatu would get if we were bringing Chinese labor in here to generate electricity? Oh, I think Mr. Vavi would be jumping on this particular desk, right? Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid, economists, you know, the wonderful thing about being an economist is that you can actually tell the truth sometimes as well. The reality is that the South African workers are quite often overpaid if you compare to what they produce. Now, if we want to compete with the Chinese, for example, or with the Indians, and more so with countries like, for example, the Brazilians, we have to do one or two things, our labor force. Either you have to increase your productivity, or you have to take a cut in wages. Because if we don't do that, there's no way we can compete.
Okay, but then I can't see this whole thing working with South Africa and the BRICS.
No, it's going to work eventually. Of course, there's going to be a lot of kicking and screaming. The politicians are going to put up all sort of hurdles. But at least it's a step in the right direction. South Africa, the South African economy integrated the last 20 years, I mean, with the rest of the world, and it's just amazing to see how the trade patterns with South Africa and its main trading partners changed the last couple of years. And fortunately for us, our main trading partners today are actually the East. There was the past 10 years, there was a huge increase in our trade with, well, the rest, which is a good thing.
Who's our biggest trading partner?
Well, depending how you, depending how you want to
Who do we export the most?
We export the most to the East as a bloc. Okay. We import the most from the East as a bloc. As a single most important trading partner, I think Germany is still the most important trading partner, but perhaps you can argue that Germany is part of Europe. You look, so Europe combined with the UK, imports and export combined, Europe is a very important and very close to the East as the most important trading partner. But that doesn't really matter. The important thing is that we improved or increased our trade with the East, and that is where the economic growth is taking place. If you want to make buddies with somebody in a club, make buddies with a club where things are going well. And things are certainly going well in countries like, for example, in China and India.
Now, the reason for this discussion, why it came about, was out of one of the other shows we did earlier this year. People started wanting to find out more about this Bric, the association with the BRICS. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I think a lot of small to medium businessmen were watching and thought, wait, hang on, maybe there's an opportunity here. One of the questions that has come through is would this mean that there'd be any sort of alliances and preferential trade agreements between the countries?
There might eventually be some sort of preferential trade agreement, but what's been happening globally is that we're actually trying to break down all these hurdles. There's something called the World Trade Organization, and they try to break down these trade hurdles that politicians all the way put in the place of business people. What I think, remember Bric, or BRICS now with South Africa included, is not really an official institution or a club yet. It's probably going to become that. So there are no real agreements that they can enter into yet. It may evolve into something like that. It doesn't mean if South Africa is not part of BRIC that we can't anyway approach the Chinese for some sort of special trade deal. But I do think the reality now is that we are kind of officially part of an unofficial organization now, and that I think it certainly elevates South Africa's political stance globally. It really elevates our political power a little bit, because we simply cannot be compared to those economies, and perhaps that will give us an opportunity to make a little bit more business contact, and it may eventually lead to some business deals, perhaps on a higher level, which will eventually filter down to the rest of the smaller economies as well. It doesn't mean that if we haven't been a part of that, we couldn't have capitalized on some agreement between the Chinese and South Africa as well. But I do think the more we're involved and the more we are on a good footing with the really big, strong, growing economies like the Chinese, the better it will eventually be for South Africa.
Okay, I accept that, if that's what you say. But what I want to do is I want to do a little test here. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to go 10 years ahead. Right? So I'll make out I'm starting the show again. Okay. You and I are very fortunate because in 10 years' time we're going to look exactly the same. How good is that? Eh?
If you're lucky, you're lucky.
Right.
Hey?
So then I sit here and I look at the camera and I go, good evening. Welcome to Mansfields Money Sense. It's January 2021. Dawie Roodt was on the show 10 years ago. We were talking about BRICS, so we thought we'd bring him back on the show 10 years on, and would you believe it? I still look the same, and I've still got a hangover. It's been a 10-year hangover. Dawie still looks the same. Dawie, how's this whole BRIC thing going? Where do we stand?
What's been happening the past 10 years?
The past 10 years.
The Chinese economy has been growing at a breakneck speed the last, like the previous 20 years as well.
Right.
The Indian economy has been growing very strong. The same for the Brazilians and the Russians and many other economies as well. The Americans have been losing out to big time because the past 10 years the American economy has been going nowhere. The same going for most of the European economies as well. So certainly so far this century has been the century of the rest. And the guys that are in very clear leadership of the rest are certainly the Chinese. And fortunately for us in South Africa, we created this thing, or we became part of this club, which is today a very formal club, and many other countries are involved or are members of this new club.
I mean, Turkey's involved there, Mexico's involved.
The Turks are there, and maybe some other economies, like for example the Egyptians could be there as well, and some other weird economies, like fortunately there was a more rational economic policies in Venezuela, and they part of it as well, maybe even Cuba part of this. And what is very clear, America, that was the dominant political and economic force the past 100 years, is not the most important political force anymore. All these sort of alliances, the result of that is that these different alliances now actually represent an economic group that will probably produce something in the region between 60 and 70% of total global output. And the small minor economies like the American economies is probably producing something between 15 and perhaps 20% of the global economic output.
Okay.
We are part of this new economic bloc.
Whoa. Is that honestly where you see this going?
Most
Really?
definitely. The American economy is not going to go anywhere. The European economies are not going to, and the same for the Japanese. If you want to If you want to sell microwave ovens, you can't say, well, of course you can sell it in America, but don't sell it to Americans. They've got 2, 3 in the kitchens. Go and sell it to somebody that hasn't got a microwave oven. The Chinese don't have that. Just imagine how many chicken farms you need if every Chinese eats 1 chicken a week. You need many. That's where the growth potential is. Those guys are manufacturing. The Chinese economy today is the world's factory. The South Africa and Africa is the world's mine, and Russia is the world's mine as well. The Indians are pretty much the world's service-producing economy. Their services are very good, IT stuff and all that. Brazil is the world's farm, and they're also producing some other stuff. So the combination of these 4 and now 5 economies pretty much cover everything in the world. You've got a big farm, you've got a big factory, you've got an IT place, if you like, and you've got a mine. What else do you need? We've got a world combined in one club.
Jeepers, that's a bit of a... It rocks you back when you start thinking of it from that macro perspective and where it could go. And hopefully it trickles down.
It's not new. This is actually only a return to normality. The West became very rich the past 500 years because of all sort of things that they did. And one thing that I believe they did, or 2 things they did, they embraced something called the free market system, and they embraced something called human rights. And with all the benefits with that, and that resulted in this boom in economic performance. But before that, the big economies in the world were certainly not America, certainly not the European economies, it was China. This is nothing new.
Yeah.
It's we're only returning to normality. China alone has got something like 20% of the global population. With these BRICS economies combined, and add 1 or 2 more economies there, and we've got more than 50% of the population of the world. The Americans and Europeans, there are just a few people there. And it's just natural. It's just a return to normality that the big economies in terms of population should also be the big economies in terms of the size of the economies as well.
So it's the wheels turning.
Yeah. So it's the Chinese economy, but don't be so sure the Chinese economies will keep on growing. Maybe just something in perspective. If the Chinese economy eventually becomes bigger than the US economy, it doesn't mean all the Chinese are going to be rich like the Americans. Because you've got the American economy is a very big economy, something like 20% of the world's economy at the moment, but you have to divide it amongst 300 million people. Now, if the Chinese economy eventually gets to the size of the American economy, you have to divide that amongst 1.5 billion people. So on a per capita basis, the Chinese will still be significantly poorer than the Americans, perhaps for the next 100 years or whatever.
The BRIC is going to work for South Africa.
Well,
yes or no?
Yes.
Right.
It's always good to be part of winners, of a club of winners.
Thank you, my bud. Thank you for coming on the show tonight.
Lucky.